Welcome to a night of total terror. Night of the living dead. The dead who live on living flesh. The dead whose haunted souls hunt the living. The living whose bodies are the only food for these ungodly creatures. Night of the living dead. More shattering than your strangest nightmare.
Jimmy knew all about the haunted house. He knew that it belonged to his Aunt Mary, but she would never talk about it. She said the stories about the house were silly nonsense and that there were no such things as ghosts. If all the villagers weren't a lot of superstitious idiots, she would be able to rent the house, and then she would have enough money to buy Jimmy some decent clothes and, best of all, take him to the movies as often as he would like to go. Jimmy thought about the house a lot. If he could only prove there wasn't any ghost. And so one Saturday morning when his aunt was in the village, Jimmy took the key to the haunted house and started out. Nothing to be scared of, he told himself. Ghosts aren't around in the daytime. But when he pushed through the dark, gloomy path and looked at those blank, dusty windows, he wasn't so sure. He walked up to the porch and stopped. His feet didn't seem to want to go up the steps. It took him nearly 5 minutes to persuade them to move, but they finally did. They marched him right up to the door, and Jimmy put the key in the keyhole. It turned with a squeak, and Jimmy pushed the door open and went in. The hall was empty. And then, as he stood there, listening to the bumping of his heart, gradually the light faded. The hall grew darker and darker, as if something huge had come up the porch behind him and stood there blocking the doorway. Then the door, all by itself, began to swing shut. And before he could stop it, it closed. And it was while he was pulling frantically at the handle to get out that Jimmy saw the ghost. It was a tall, dim, white figure, and it came gliding slowly down the stairs towards him. Jimmy gave a yell and yanked open the door and tore down the steps. He didn't stop until he was well down the road. Then he had to catch his breath. He sat down on a log. Boy, he thought, I've seen a ghost. Golly, that was awful. Then after a minute, he thought, what was so awful about it? He was trying to scare me like some smart aleck who's always jumping out from behind things. Pretty silly thing for a grown-up ghost to be doing. You know, it always makes you mad when someone deliberately tries to scare you. And as Jimmy got over his fright, he began to get angry. And pretty soon he got up and started back. He thought at least he would get the key which he'd left in the door. This time he approached very quietly. And as he reached out cautiously for the key, he heard a faint sound. He peeked in, and there was the ghost. He was going back upstairs, but he wasn't gliding now. He was doing sort of a dance. And every other step he would double over and shake with laughter. He was enjoying the joke he had played on the boy. Well, this made Jimmy madder than ever. He stuck his head into the hallway and yelled at the top of his lungs. Boo! The ghost gave a shriek, leaped 2 feet in the air, and then collapsed on the stairs. Well, as soon as Jimmy saw he could scare the ghost even worse than the ghost could scare him, he wasn't afraid anymore, and he came right into the hall. The ghost was hanging on the banister and panting. He looked at Jimmy and moaned, "Oh, for goodness sake, boy. Heavens to bedsheets, what an awful thing to do." Jimmy smiled at him. "Now we're even." The ghost looked pained and said, "Look-a-here, Sonny, you don't understand.
Ghosts are supposed to scare people. People aren't supposed to scare ghosts. It could be pretty serious for me if people got to know about it.
Jimmy said. You mean you don't want me to tell anybody about it?
Suppose we make a deal, the ghost said. You keep still about this, and in return, well, let's see. How would you like to know how to vanish?
Oh, but that'd be swell, Jimmy exclaimed. But can you vanish?
Sure, said the ghost.
And he did. But his voice went right on explaining how handy it would be to get into the movies free, and if anybody wanted Jimmy to do some chores, they wouldn't be able to find him. But Jimmy had been thinking about things, and he said no, that there was only one thing that would keep him from telling people how easy it was to scare ghosts, and that was for the ghost to move into the old Miller house up the road.
That old shack, said the ghost. Have a heart, boy. The doors are half off. Roof leaky, rain dripping all over the place.
So they argued about it. The ghost said if Jimmy wanted to make money, he could learn to vanish, then he could join a circus and get a big salary. Jimmy said he didn't want to be in a circus. He wanted to go to college and learn to be a doctor. So the ghost sobbed and cried and said he'd been living in the house for 30 years and now he was being thrown out into the cold world. Well, he was trying to make Jimmy feel cruel. But Jimmy didn't feel cruel at all and pointed out that the ghost had certainly driven plenty of other people out into the cold world. And at last they came to an agreement. The ghost agreed to try out the old Miller house and teach Jimmy to vanish, in return for which Jimmy promised not to tell anyone that ghosts could be scared. So Jimmy's aunt cleaned up the house and rented it to some nice people and bought Jimmy some new clothes and took him to the movies. But every Saturday morning, Jimmy went up to the old Miller house for his vanishing lessons. It is really quite easy when you know how. And after only a few weeks, he could flicker. And in 6 weeks, the ghost gave him an examination, and he got B+, which is very good for a human. He taught Jimmy several more tricks. The best one was how to glare with fiery eyes, which was useful later on when Jimmy became a doctor and had to look down people's throats. So if ever you are in the hospital and hear a voice over the loudspeaker calling, "Dr. Jim Crandall, call for Dr. Crandall," it might well be that it's Jimmy they're looking for, because every now and then he forgets himself and just vanishes.
It's a good thing to know if ever you are staring into the darkness and you see something staring back. Simply say, "Boo," and it will go away. In the time we have left, I might mention several other interesting things. Don't ever brag about what you do if you saw a ghost. It's a sure way to get them angry at you. Don't slam doors, as you might pinch a ghost. Don't leave sharp objects like knives lying around. A ghost might sit on them. Just keep convincing yourself you aren't frightened, that you are brave, that there is nothing that can scare you. I really can't go on much longer. There's only about 3 inches of airspace between the water and the ceiling. If you will be good enough to stop this record now, before the water can rise, I shall be more than grateful. Hurry, please hurry.